Hi, I'm Wendy Schneider, a filmmaker, musician, record producer, and engineer from Madison, Wisconsin. I'm also the director of the award-winning documentary Angels of Dirt.
Welcome to the Real Riders Podcast. My name's Simon Josie, and this is a podcast about motorcycling and filmmaking. If this is your first time here, welcome and thanks for listening. Who says scrolling through Instagram is a complete waste of time? I'm pretty sure I first became aware of the film Angels of Dirt via Instagram. And when I saw the film was being toured in Europe in the late spring, early summer, I thought it would be a good idea to reach out to the film's director, Wendy Schneider, and see if she would like to come onto the podcast. Obviously, I got a positive response, and you'll shortly hear my conversation with Wendy, which was recorded in the middle of May. Angels of Dirt has already played at the recent Lisbon Motorcycle Film Fest, and anyone who attended the recent Bike Shed Moto Show London 2025 may have seen the film there too. If you're listening to this episode on the day of publication, there are still some upcoming dates to see the film in Europe. Check out the film's website, www.angelsofdirt.com, for more information. The link is in the show notes. Before we get to my chat with Wendy, remember Real Riders has an account on Instagram where you will find, amongst other things, trailers for each new episode. And if you want to know what I've been watching recently, follow the Real Riders account on Bluesky. Links for both the Instagram and Bluesky accounts are in the show notes. As always, if you're so inclined, please consider rating or liking the Real Riders podcast in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. This will help other listeners find the podcast. Righto, let's get to my talk with Wendy. Welcome to the podcast, Wendy. Thanks for joining me on the show today. How are you?
I'm really good, Simon. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm also very good, thanks.
Good.
It's summer, and that means motorcycle riding time, but we've got a podcast to record first. You must be just days away from jumping on a plane as we record this to bring Angels of Dirt to Europe for its summer 2025 tour. How are preparations going for that?
As we speak, I am cutting stickers that are going to come with me on the plane to Portugal. Someone donated 1,000 stickers for me to go on tour. That would be Tim Hendrick from Pro Plates, one of my sponsors. And so cutting sheets of 1,000 stickers down to single stickers that's my task this morning before I leave on Wednesday for Portugal. And we show the film on Friday night.
Yeah. I was speaking to a new friend who's somewhat associated with the festival there, and he was saying, "Oh, you're coming." I said, "Oh, no, I'm not coming this time." He said, "Well, you've got to come next year. It's the 10th edition, I think. So I'm going to make a big effort to try and get to the Lisbon Motorcycle Film Fest next year." Yeah.
Yeah, they really have their shit together. We kick off at the Lisbon Motorcycle Film Festival, and they have been just wonderful and accommodating for both myself and the film.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
The life and career of flat track racer Charlotte Kainz is at the centre of Angels of Dirt. Did you set out to make a film about motorcycle racing and then discover Charlotte's story, or was Charlotte's story sort of the entry point for you for the film?
Meeting Charlotte Kainz was gateway for the story of Angels of Dirt, and she was, in fact, the first young girl that I was introduced to when I showed up with a camera at her amateur track in Wisconsin. And so meeting her and her family and the friends around her really became like this early thread that I was following to develop a story that was back in 2006 when the project began, very superficial. You know, who are you? Why do you race? Do you like to go fast? There was not a lot of dimension to those early interviews, but yeah, Charlotte was recommended to me on my way to the track that morning, and the first young racer that I interviewed.
What brought you to the track? I mean, what brought you to the topic, I guess, in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a racer, I'm a street rider, but I would pass Aztalan, which is the amateur track that I shot at. I would pass Aztalan on the way from Madison, Wisconsin to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You can see it from the interstate. But by the time you saw the track, you'd missed the exit. So there was never a real easy way to access Aztalan unless you intentionally decided to go and sort of explore your curiosity. So I showed up, and over the course of a year, I probably went to half a dozen races, and seeing the young girls racing was very intriguing and inspiring to me. And I had a camera at the time, so I just showed up and started doing interviews.
And so Charlotte wasn't the only young girl racing. She was one of many.
I wouldn't say many, but she was one of a handful of young girls that were fast, competent, part of the scene. There were two groups of racers where I was shooting. There was the flat track group and there was the motocross group. So I would show up on different days to shoot different races. But flat track was really where I started to gravitate mostly because of the community. I just felt like I was developing deeper relationships with the community in flat track. And of course, I was spending a lot of time with Charlotte and some other girls at the time. The young girls that were there were catching my eye because there weren't that many of them, but they were integrated into all of the races. There weren't just girls' races. These were just kids' races or young adult races.
Through making the film, do you feel you got close to knowing what motivated Charlotte, why she loved flat track racing, and why she wanted to race professionally?
Well, it was evident because it was every answer that she gave me. And when I was questioning her about, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what do you enjoy about racing? I think she enjoyed the feeling on the bike. She enjoyed winning. She enjoyed going fast. She had her sights set on becoming a professional flat track racer. She knew what motorcycle she was going to race. She wanted to race an XR 750, Harley Davidson. So Charlotte knew from a very young age that was her goal. I think other children that I met who were, the young interviewees that I had hung out with and interviewed, they weren't specifically dedicating their experience to a channel going to a professional level, but Charlotte really was.
Do you think, because she started so young, do you think she had any choice? I mean, she started when she was 4, is that right?
She started riding at 4, racing at 5, yeah.
Right, okay. So it's almost like from one of her very first memories would have been on a motorcycle. I just wonder if you're brought up in such a way, do you almost have a choice? There's no option. You're going to ride, you're possibly going to race. Or is that perhaps too crude an assumption on my part?
I don't know if it's a crude assumption. I think it's a fair assumption as you're looking in at a community where you see young children, racing at young ages. But there are certainly young children at the racetrack that weren't racing, that were there with their families. Charlotte did have a parent that raced. Her father, Jack, raced. She was around it. She was not pushed onto a bike as much as she was welcomed into the family of racers that she belonged to and also her community. But I think that you could tell, like, she just enjoyed racing that little motorcycle, even if it was her 50cc bike. I mean, Charlotte wrote a book when she was in 2nd grade that won an award called Flat Tracker, and this was her vision of herself. So I think that it was different with all kids. I think I could sometimes tell a kid that was kind of a weekend rider because their grandfather wanted to, introduce them to this experience. But I would say that most kids at a certain level will grow out of it if they're not dedicated, because they're not going to have a satisfactory time on the track. Flat track is competitive. So if you're not competitive, if you don't feel that in your belly, in your spirit, then you're going to choose something else to do.
Do you have an understanding why some folk are so passionately motivated to race? I mean, you just mentioned this passion for racing. Why some folk are so passionate about racing, despite the well-known and the well-understood risks, the physical risks to do with this activity particularly?
I think I'm not the best person to ask that question because what would motivate somebody is such a personal decision or feeling that they have. All of the racers that I encountered making, well, let's see, that, Angels of Dirt was made in two eras. There's this first era when Charlotte was young and I was interviewing all these other girls. And it was girls that were racing and excited about racing, or officials, parents, cousins, friends who were passionate about watching those girls race, right? So that was really the focus of that early footage. But then we lost Charlotte. And so everything was reflective. And I had to piece together a story that was about Charlotte's life using all of that footage. So my focus after 2016 was really focused not as general as it was in 2006, 7, 8, those early years. It was really about crafting a story that was going to represent who Charlotte was in the context of racing.
I'm assuming you were granted very generous access by Charlotte's family to home videos, to photos and things like that, which obviously gives so much colour and depth to the film. Can you describe how you gained that trust with Charlotte's family?
I had established trust with not only Charlotte's family, but Charlotte's community, because everybody had some footage to give or pictures to give. There were professional photographers, amateur photographers. Once it was established that I was finishing the film with a focus on Charlotte, I rarely had to ask. Sometimes I was offered, if I did have to ask for photos or footage, it was like, here's a box, Wendy, go for it. Here are the family tapes, go for it. Here's pictures, go for it. I didn't have to bargain or solicit, in any way. I think that I was trying to paint the richest picture of not only Charlotte, but of flat track racing, a picture of other women in the context of the history of flat track. So I really did my best as somebody, this is a project of one person. I was editing, researching, I did the score of the film. So I just got as much as I possibly could. I was not like an archive department or a research department. I was just making phone calls and emails, but everything came very easily. I think that people trusted where I was going with the story, and I really appreciate that.
I mean, you get that sense, at least I got that sense from watching the many people that you interviewed, that there was no doubt in their mind where the film was heading, and that it would represent honestly, truthfully, and positively Charlotte's life. What was it like when you first showed it to them?
Well, the film was accepted to the Wisconsin Film Festival in April of 2023, or could have been 2024. 2024, it was going to premiere. The September prior to that, so September of 2023, I actually rented a theater in Milwaukee, and I invited 200 friends and family, because I wanted the community who had supported me for so long and who were connected to Charlotte. I wanted all of us to see the film first and see it together. And that includes Charlotte's family. Nobody had seen a cut of the film, one or two people. But that was really important to me, to know that I had crossed that finish line and was able to then move forward, feeling that I had the advocacy that I needed for the project, for the story, and for the work I was going to do to move forward. It was incredible. It's a really beautiful night.
I can imagine, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
As highlighted in the film, Charlotte seemed older than her years, and she was able to relate really well to people older than herself, and also to her peers as well. But was that your experience? Is that something that you observed yourself, knowing Charlotte and seeing her as a young girl? Did you see this yourself?
Not in a direct way. I knew that from how I witnessed Charlotte, living her life. I was always in Charlotte's life as an awkward filmmaker. I was developing relationship with Charlotte over a number of years when she was very young, and I was a young filmmaker. This was my second film at the time. I took a break to make my third film. To make another film, so I took breaks from the film to work on other projects. But when I started the film, she was young, and so was I as a filmmaker. And I think that I saw how relatable she was with anyone that she was engaging with, whether it was a race official, whether it was somebody doing a tech check, whether it was somebody younger, one of her contemporaries, or, the dozens of men that she rode with who were older than her, who all felt like she was their beacon. Charlotte was an influence on so many levels to her friends and contemporaries. So I loved witnessing that and being a part of it as a filmmaker.
Actually, that kind of reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from the film. And I'm sorry, I can't remember who spoke, but he said, "You wanted to stay behind her just to watch her ride."
Yeah.
Because of her form, because she was such a skilled practitioner of what she was doing. They wanted to see just how well she was doing, because she was doing it. They wanted to follow her
Yeah.
form. Yeah.
Right. And that's spoken by somebody who'd watched her since she was 5, right? So these are older, mostly men, watching her develop a style and a skill and a dedication that was supported by and influenced by her father. But it was really, that was Charlotte. That was who she was. And so to watch someone become, from a form standpoint, from a style standpoint, who you want to emulate, who you are looking at for cues, was just a remarkable transition, because this is a young girl. I think she was, maybe 10, 11, when that comment was said. I mean, she was so dedicated and so driven, but she also had a life that was, fun and social, and, playing softball and drawing. And, she was a very dimensional human being.
Mm-hmm. The relationship with the father is obviously kind of critical to the whole thing, because he was obviously the one who encouraged her right from the start to get into motorcycling. The film is full of memorable quotes and stories, and one of my favorites was of Charlotte's father explaining how he needed to employ message deliverers. And this is my term, okay? And by that I mean, she'd got to an age where, naturally a little bit rebellious, I imagine, in her teens, and it was a little bit difficult to get his message across, shall we say. And so he had sort of employed these other members of the community to sort of convey his message, and it seemed to be quite successful. Did you go looking for this insight, or was that actually offered up to you voluntarily?
That insight was offered up voluntarily, because I was in the interview with her father, Jack. I was asking, what began to shift when she became a young adult, when she was becoming a teen. And you are her father, you're her coach, you're her mentor, you're her trainer. But Charlotte is starting to exert independence, but still Jack knowing that she still needed his guidance. And so his strategy for influencing her was to talk to Ion Steer or to talk to Dave Kilkenny, so that that message would come from racers and friends that she really looked up to. Yeah, I thought it was brilliant, and probably not uncommon, in family dynamics, but it really worked with Charlotte.
The film weaves a number of female riders' stories into the narrative, as you've mentioned already. During filming, did it occur to you that you could perhaps make a separate film about each of those riders, and hence how much of those riders' stories was left on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. The first part of your question, absolutely. I feel like the young riders and racers that I was interviewing in the first era of this film were so rich, all of them, so rich. And the film, in a very general way, would have sort of represented all these young girls. But I feel, looking back, or looking at it now with the footage that I have, I think that it would have taken on a kind of highlights reel outcome. To go back now, and this is still on the table, and to do shorts on the interviews, with some of the women, would be very interesting as a retrospective project. And some of that will go up on the Angels of Dirt YouTube page as Angels moves out. Derivative work that still falls under Angels of Dirt will definitely become available. But there were so many elements of interviews that I thought, oh, well, there's a connection to that young girl, or there's a connection to an industry that's outside of motorcycle racing. There are all these connections that filmmakers make, and they think, all right, maybe I'll run with that. Maybe I'll run with that. And Charlotte was, in the flat track community, somebody that I kept coming back to, I think largely because I was developing deeper friendships with that community. And interestingly, when I came back and was doing the finishing interviews to the film, after Charlotte passed, I really had to put a better boundary between me and the community. I had to come back in as a filmmaker because it was very difficult to go back into this project. It was really one of the hardest things that I've ever done because I was so personally connected. I was not making a film about a racer that we'd lost too soon. I didn't come in and start doing these interviews about a racer I didn't know, who I was going to get to know through these stories. I had a personal relationship with Charlotte and her family and the track, and I needed to manage that relationship within myself, and that was really challenging. But to speak to, the other stories, the little sub stories, there are many, and they are varied, and they are colorful, and they are, I think, just waiting for me.
You mentioned the racing, or how much racing was included in the story, because one of the things that I was thinking about while I was watching it was, I wonder how much of the racing and sort of maybe the history and explanation of particularly the flat track kind of racing, that topic, I wonder how much you felt you needed to bring into the film. And did you ever feel sort of an obligation rather than a creative response to how much you were going to include into that? That was one thing that
Yeah,
occurred to me. I wondered how much you felt that you needed maybe some broader context about racing, about flat track racing, for
sure.
maybe a wider audience that doesn't understand this world.
Yeah, 100%. That's the audience. The audience is not the friends and family for Angels of Dirt. The audience is the broader audience. And without including the dimension of racing, the context of, place and track, and what it means to race flat track and who races flat track, nobody would understand, because flat track is still this sort of anomaly genre of racing. I mean, it's not, I don't know about anomaly, but I have to explain what flat track racing is to almost everyone that I know who doesn't know what flat track racing is, and that's a lot of people. But I want them to see this story about this young person who was extraordinary to watch, to get to know, and to see interact with her community. I mean, Charlotte had a flair of character that was very subtle and very humble and very respectful of who she was and who her friends were, and that mixed in with motorcycle racing, it just brings electricity to this particular story. But I did want the audience to get a sense of, what is flat track racing? Why are people passionate about it? And I think that the film succeeds in doing that. And I know only because, when we premiered in Wisconsin, it was about 600 people in the audience, and I would say 5% knew what flat track racing was. And that was our sort of biggest award to date. I think people really were electrified by what flat track is and want to know more about it. But Angels of Dirt, I think, is a gateway film for this particular type of racing, because when you want to know more, you can find out, you can learn more.
You talk about community. You've mentioned this community around Charlotte several times. You've interviewed a lot of people for the film. Was that actually a mechanism to convey just how broad and how deep that community was around her, by having so many voices in the film?
I think that, there are a lot of interviews that are not in the film, right? I think you have to look at what's going to make sense for the story that you're trying to take. But it's a very common thread, sort of the way that what people recognized in Charlotte and in the community, it's articulated in a way that's kind of similar with a lot of people. I think that there is a, a real, value that people place on the experience in amateur flat track, And that experience becomes more intense as you rise up, go up the ranks into the pro levels. There are different things at stake. There's different levels of financial commitment, sponsor commitment, regulations. It's very different once you turn pro. But that environment back then that Charlotte was in was not uncommon. I think that's why the film resonates with other audiences that are connected to Flat Track, because that community is very real to them as well. So there's something that's inherent, I feel, in flat track racing. Now, I'm biased because this is all I'm paying attention to right now, but I think that it's a lovely form of expression in the story when you can really convey a strong sense of organic community that people feel, because I believe that that's something we all gravitate towards, is something where we feel like we belong here.
I want to pick up on another sort of theme that comes through, and it's about this term fearlessness. And I wondered, does that term or that description, fearlessness, does that hold a fascination for you? It kind of holds a bit of a fascination for me.
Mm-hmm.
A number of speakers featured in the film mentioned that Charlotte was fearless. And it's often a term associated with sports people, particularly for those, who pursue sports that have got some sort of physical risk involved. Do you think Charlotte lacked fear, or was she able to manage or compartmentalize her fear?
It's a really good question, really good topic, is fear and fearlessness. One of the taglines that I use for the film is the ability to be fearless is every girl's right, as if somebody has taken that away from young girls. I think that in doing interviews with racers about fear and fearlessness, there were occasions where racers just did not incorporate that into their mindset, because if fear or fearlessness was part of their mindset, they probably shouldn't be racing. You don't want to go into a race saying to yourself, I'm going to conquer my fears, I'm going to be fearless. I think you walk into that race with confidence and determination and a mindset that says go, that brings into your experience every skill that you've learned, every training that you've done. It is not about conquering a fear. I've never heard a racer talk about conquering their fears. But I think that it's common for us, and it's normal for us to say, like, wow, she's so fearless. But she's really dedicated. She's really ready. That's what she is. She's ready on the line. She is drawing from her training on the line. It's not that she's without fear. That's sort of like, yeah, of course she's without fear, because if she had any fear, she probably shouldn't be racing. I don't think that flat track on certain levels is certainly you hear people be like, oh my God, it was so exciting. I was so afraid. I was so scared. I did it. That is part of the processing of emotional experience. But the role of fear and the word, fearless, I think, depending on who you interview, is going to be handled somewhat differently.
Yeah, because fear is connected to bravery as well. And I've often wondered whether you can't be brave if you have no fear, in the sense that if you're not feeling fear, then you're not actually being brave because you're not overcoming anything. But I don't know if that's too simple or simplistic.
I don't know. Or is that the word that you're attaching to the anxiety before the light goes green? I think that anxiety can propel you forward. Anxiety is a signal that your body is giving you that says, okay, pay attention. Let's pay attention. Fear is just different, I think, for everyone, but really like flat track racers. And I think that it was more on the pro level, that if you are dealing with some kind of a fear, you probably shouldn't get on that bike.
Yeah. The film took 17 years to make. How did you manage the creative process and the focus over such a long period? I mean, that seems amazing to me.
Yeah, I think, there was a break in the film where I did another project, right? And during the course of those 6 years, I would dabble with Angels of Dirt, but I didn't know how to get back to it. I had put Angels of Dirt on the shelf in around 2009 because I'd been in a terrible car accident and needed some time to heal. And so I spent a year not working on much of anything. And then another project came my way. I started working on that project and then continuing to dabble with Angels of Dirt. Maybe I was logging footage, looking at footage, not knowing how I was going to get back to that work and not knowing if there was a deep enough story for me to continue. I really did not know how to finish Angels. It would have meant, like restarting interviews, and it felt like I needed to go backwards to go forwards with Angels of Dirt. And then we lost Charlotte in 2016, and it was pivotal. I just knew where I was going, and it was going to be challenging because I was going to be starting from a certain place. I was starting at the beginning of a different story that was incorporating all of that footage. So between that and, again, I'm editing and shooting and producing the music. So that's why, for a lot of reasons, it just took a long time, and raising money and just stopping because it was exhausting, working on it. And I had to do other work to pay the bills. So I think it was probably 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where I really began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Some people had come in and watched cuts of the film, which at that time were very long, like 2.5 hours or 3 hours. But I got a lot of validation from those early screenings. And then I felt like I knew where I was going. And it was just a matter of sculpting the story that we're going to see on this particular tour. So it took as long as it took. I mean, I, in my heart, feel like, maybe I'm not completely done. Maybe I would tweak the film, but the film is in a very strong position as a pre-release project to show, to get feedback, to shop, to look for a sales agent. I'm now better positioned to help the film launch. And I didn't want to let it go. I mean, Charlotte was, that was a deep, deep loss. It still felt very deeply. And this is one contribution to that healing is Angels of Dirt.
Mm. I hear this quite often with musicians, and you're a musician, you're a producer, as you mentioned at the top as well, that you've got to find a discipline to say, this piece is done. I'm talking about an original piece. It's done. It could be better, whatever, but I've got to walk away and work on something else because otherwise I'll never walk away. Is that something you find in music as well when you're making music?
With music, I tend to have an easier time letting go. I think I am at a point in my life where I can release ideas and projects that are at a certain stage and feel like I'm ready to share this. Do I need to go back to it? Does it need finishing work? Do I just want to move on to something else? When you're an independent, producer and musician and filmmaker, and I'm not beholden to somebody saying, you need to shave 5 minutes off this film and it needs to be like this, and that. Mind you, I would still do that if somebody was interested in, talking about Angels. But I think I have a relatively, I'm not a crazy perfectionist. I feel like when I'm ready to put something out, it's reached a level that I'm really comfortable with, so much so that I want to share it. Yeah, with Angels, I can see areas that I want to change all the time. Does it mean that the film is not in pre-release and being shown? No, I'm really happy with where the film's at right now. That said, I expect to do some tweaking here or there. And there's still not, honestly, and I apologize to people who watch these, but there's not a real, a really powerful trailer for this film at this time. There are some trailers out there, but that's something that takes time and effort. And I just haven't had a lot of time to go back into the editing room.
One thing that fascinates me a little bit is, the film's, I think, 88 minutes long. Is that right? Something like almost an hour and a half, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And holding a piece of art in your head and working on that piece of art of such duration just seems like quite a mammoth exercise for me personally. I'm quite intimidated by the thought of that. tell me, what kind of music do you typically make? Are you typically making like 3, 4, 5-minute pieces of music? Is that sort of your go-to? Okay, so you're nodding, so that's a yes.
I mean, I'm in a rock band, right? I've been in rock bands, and if you look at how independent rock bands release music and records and touring, it's a direct rip. That's what Angels of Dirt is doing. I'm making T-shirts and stickers and patches, and I'm taking this on the road as an independent. And that's my model. So I think that's what you see. That's what you hear in the music. I am really comfortable writing anything from 3 to 5 minutes. I do that for clients, and I did it for the film. And that's where the musician comes on board.
Right. And so what I was thinking is that it's one thing to create something that's, say, 5 minutes long max, and another thing to create something that's 90 minutes long. And I see one thing being a little bit easier to hold in my head than a 90-minute film. And so that's why I was wondering, I'm quite impressed that you inhabit those two worlds, because I could imagine someone who's great at making 5-minute short films or 5-minute pieces of music would really struggle with a 90-minute artistic project. That's where I was coming from.
Yeah, I think, for me, the music in Angels of Dirt, I think that's really my voice. I'm strong in that area because I'm a songwriter and a music producer. My first experience in New York City working in multimedia was to underscore visuals, not originally, but I was selecting music. I had to connect an emotional component to a visual experience. That is my training. When I was 17 years old, I was learning how to do that, with my boss, Chris Drury. So it's mentor, more of a boss, less of a boss. Yeah. So it's, the music part of it, that came natural.
Okay, this question I fear is going to be too simplistic, but I'm going to still throw it out there and ask, was this the film that you set out to make?
If you asked me in 2006, no. If you asked me in 2016, yes. So there's a 10-year gap. The first person I met was Charlotte Kainz, right? So the first day of filming, my life completely changed. It was a gateway into a story that she was at the center of. And in 2016, with the loss of Charlotte, that again changed the course of my life with respect to this film. So the moments are key for me. In fact, in 2016, I was in Milwaukee releasing my film about smart studios. So that was the premiere of my film in Milwaukee was in 2016. And it was the same night I was making a condolence call to Charlotte's father. So the project for me and the work that I've done, these moments that I've experienced have been really powerful and pivotal, and not without a spiritual component. Like, well, now this is happening. And I remember in the Q&A in Milwaukee in 2016, asked what my next project was. And I said, I'm going to finish Angels of Dirt. And it was the first time that I'd articulated that, only moments after, not moments, but a few hours after leaving her home. Mm. So, yeah, interesting paths and channels that open up on that path.
Mm-hmm. Wendy, you've mentioned that you've done other films. How did you actually get into filmmaking? That's always an interesting question for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, it was just by chance, because really I was a musician with a recording studio. And so, working with media was not foreign to me. And I had an early background in media production, but it was not a filmmaker. And there was something going on in Madison where I live. There was like a short film contest, make a 7-minute film and submit it. And my friend's daughter was struggling with self-injury. And I asked if she would be interviewed because I thought that she'd make an interesting subject to explore this topic in this short film. At the time, Garbage, the band, was recording in Madison. Shirley's a good friend of mine. And I knew from her interviews that she had struggled with self-injury. She had experience with that. She agreed to be interviewed for the film. And then with those two subjects and a counselor, I had this really nice combination of, this icon, this rock icon who was really giving a platform to healing, this young teen who is still dealing with self-injury and an expert. And so I felt compelled to put something together that was going to be helpful for audiences, parents, teens, and mental health professionals. And then the response was so good that I interviewed like 20 more people and just made it into more of an education film that I then toured around the country for a couple of years presenting. So that's how I became a filmmaker. I was not a filmmaker. I wouldn't even consider, I look at that film and it looks like a kind of poetic rendition of some, stories and interviews. But right after that, Smart Studios, a very iconic recording studio in Madison, closed. I had worked there. I knew the owners very well. And I was just, asked to do sort of the retrospective on the film. So that's how that happened. And I think I really honed some skills making that film. And that, as I said earlier, just led right into Angels of Dirt, which I'd been making sort of throughout all of that time.
Yeah. So that first film, is it called Cut or Cuts?
Yeah, it's called Cut, Teens and Self-Injury. And it is available for free on Vimeo. Or you can find it, if you go to wendyschneider.com, you can usually find it.
Yeah, and I noticed that Smart Studio is also available online. And actually, I've made a note. I want to watch that because
Good.
That era of music and music making, and I'm a little bit familiar with it, and I'm quite excited actually to watch that. But
good.
I'm looking forward to it because that's also like 90 minutes long or something. It's also a full length documentary. Like, wow, you've made 3 films and 2 of them have been massive documentaries. That's impressive.
Thank you.
What type of stories interest you and drive the passion and perseverance that's actually necessary to create long form documentaries?
Whew. The last 2 long form documentaries, I didn't choose them, right? Smart closed. And all of a sudden, there is an end to something that began 28 years prior. So there you have it. Something is bookended by a crazy soft launch with all these amazing creative people back in the 80s. And then you have sort of the devastating loss after that institution has made inroads into the lives of people in the community and also around the world. So there's that picture. With Angels of Dirt, it was just going along. It was nebulous, if you want to know the truth. It was like great interviews, some awesome footage, a lot of shitty footage, but some really great footage, interesting characters. And then the film, pivots so traumatically and significantly in 2016. So there you have this beginning and this end story-wise. But the Angels of Dirt, that story does not end with the loss of Charlotte. It actually begins this chapter of recognition and connection and community and love and experience and how she is still part of our lives. Smart was like an easier version of loss. With Angels of Dirt, it was really the belly of the beast of loss. Like, how do we channel this? What do we do with it? And anyone in motorsports or extreme sports understands that there is loss of life in extreme sports and in any sport, of course. But, I think that what I feel Angels of Dirt does is it really brings that loss right into the room with everyone at the same time, particularly at these screenings. And it doesn't let you out. This is part of our lives. Like, the healing is part of our lives. The sorrow is part of our lives. And I've seen that and been part of that with Angels of Dirt. It can be really hard to get through some screenings, and it can be incredibly celebratory to get through others. And that is where we are at the time, with projects like these.
Would it be right for me to interpret then that you're really looking forward to basically observing how the audiences in Europe react to the film and actually being in the room while they are reacting to it?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I sit in and sometimes I don't. It can just feel like, okay, I watched it last night. Do I need to watch it tonight? I'm not in the room looking at people reacting, but I really love it when people laugh and when people are so connected and engaged that they do have an audible response to something that's happening in the film, I feel like that's them being touched. That's the film is now a part of their engagement. And, any filmmaker would say that that's really fun to experience. I love speaking with people afterwards. I appreciate when somebody comes up to me after a screening who was there when we lost Charlotte. I think that's a moment of like deep intensity for me, that I'm with someone who is with one of the most significant moments in my life was that loss, and the phone call that I got, and people who relate to it, who are in Germany, who might relate to this story that's in the middle of Wisconsin. I find that absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so before I let you go, I'm going to ask you a little bit about motorcycling. Like, you've told us that you're a street rider, so what kind of motorcycle are you riding these days?
I think in 2010, I got a KZ 400. It's a 1979 motorcycle, and I still have it. And I love riding it, even though right now it needs a starter. So I'm not riding it currently. I've always ridden. I've ridden that bike, since then. I had a 404 Super Sport, a Honda, when I was in high school. I like those cafe racer type bikes that you can zip around on. I feel like I'm leaning towards a dual sport bike now because I like to ride in the woods as opposed to ride on the street. I don't want to go like on the road. I don't want to go across the country on a highway with a motorcycle. I have no interest in that. I'd like to put my bike on the back of my car and find some woods with some people and learn what that's like, because those folks seem to be having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it's from what I observe as well, and I talk to a lot of guests who are in that community, and it seems to be a very supportive community, a good-hearted, supportive community. Yeah. Okay, a couple of last questions. To start with, what experiences have influenced your work?
That's a heavy question, but a great one, because I feel like there's a lot of my own healing is in the last few films that I've done, with Teens and Self-Injury, with Smart Studios, with Angels of Dirt. I think all of those are dealing with different types of struggles. There's conflict, and there's conflict in documentaries and films. I think that that's part of the equation. But my personal experience, I had a lot of loss in my life. I think that healing from that loss made me a good candidate to do films that have to deal with, or that do deal with, losing something that is important to you. I find that interviewing individuals around that topic, it's not that it's easier for me. I feel like I just relate to even the questions that I'm asking on a personal level. I think that it strengthens your ability to be an empath around that loss and what somebody might be feeling. And I hope that my projects give people, a platform to express that in a way that feels safe and healing for them. With the film about self-injury, and I struggled with an eating disorder when I was younger. So here I came from this experience that was figuring out how to regulate my feelings and how to cope with things when I was younger. And I found that parallel with self-injurious behavior inescapable. So I was provoking thoughts around that, in myself. And then I think I was a better interviewer because of that. So the experience of loss informs almost everything that I do, but also the experiences that are in addition to loss, like, all the good experiences that I've had, that informs me as well. But Charlotte, Angels of Dirt was a personal challenge to have to keep coming back to, wanting to get it right, not only for myself, but for her father and for her friends and for the community. And I hope that it's a testament to how we all are continuing to move through this shift in our lives without Charlotte Kainz.
Final question, and it's about motorcycling and filmmaking. Having made a film about motorcycling, what impact has that had on your own enthusiasm for motorcycling?
That's such a good question. Because of the people that I'm meeting around this film, I have never wanted to ride more because most people that I'm connected to on Instagram or WhatsApp or with a festival or with a host, they're all out riding and enjoying themselves most weekends. So there is an allure, of that experience that wasn't there, I think, maybe 5 years ago. Now that the film is out and about, I'm meeting more people who are really professing their enjoyment of not only motorcycle racing, but just hanging with friends, having fun weekends and visiting beautiful places. And I want to experience some of that. And, we have Revit came on board. Revit in Holland has come on board to sponsor a couple of screenings, and they're making it possible for me to do some riding. They're sending me some gear and I'm getting a motorcycle, but I think that there is a shout out to Revit and all the sponsors actually who are helping with this tour, all the hosts and friends who are helping me get where I need to go. So I think that I'm a more enthusiastic, casual rider. Yeah. I've never wanted to race. I'm not a racer.
Thanks so much for being my guest for this episode, Wendy. Where can listeners find out more about Angels of Dirt, and where might they be able to see the film?
Thanks, Simon. Anyone looking for information on Angels of Dirt can go directly to our website. That's angelsofdirt.com. You can access our Instagram. You can see our tour. You can read about any press interviews that I've done. And importantly, we just launched a GoFundMe to help raise funds to get me back to the U.S. because this tour is being personally funded. So we would love your support. I hope that I can see some of your listeners at a screening in Europe or back here in the States.
Great. Look, thanks again. Best wishes for the European tour of the film. Take care and ride safe.
Thank you so much.